Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your hand and give a warm welcome to your host, Albert Alegria Valdez. Alright, hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of CTT, the show where you Catholic teens ask me questions and I answer them on my very own TV show. On last week's episode, we spoke about economic justice, so if you haven't already, go check that out. So I think it's about time we get started, and if you're new to the show, let me tell you how it works. You teenagers ask me questions through the mail, and my team puts them together all in this magical napkin box. And at the beginning of every episode, I pick one, and one of you lucky teenagers gets their question covered on my show. And without further ado, I think it's time to pick one. Here we have Nishida Menon from St. Francis Xavier wants to learn all about the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. Well, that's a good question, Nishida, and we'll get right into it after these short messages. Don't go anywhere. So, what is preferential option for the poor? Well, preferential option for the poor, let's call that POP for time's sake, is when we put the needs of the most underprivileged and the most needy people first. Well, why should we do that? Well, God teaches us to love and care for everybody with no exception, but especially those in most need of help. In my professional opinion, this is one of the most important Catholic social teachings because it affects everybody all around the world. So what does Scripture have to say about POP? Well, Scripture refers to POP multiple times, and here are a few examples. Exodus chapter 22, verse 20 to 26. You shall not oppress the poor and vulnerable. God will hear their cry. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 5 to 7. True worship is work for justice and care for the poor and oppressed. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9 to 10. A portion of the harvest is set aside for the poor and the stranger. All of these verses teach us to care especially for the poor because they're not as fortunate as others. So which virtue relates to this teaching? Well, justice is the act of seeking to promote fairness and equality amongst all. It's thinking of the needs of others before yours. This moral virtue has a lot to do with POP because they both revolve around one main point, that is the well-being of others in need of help. Well, what about vices? Well, yeah, there are some vices that are related to this Catholic social teaching, which are arrogance and greed. Now, people that are arrogant tend to see themselves as more superior to others, and especially to those who are poor or vulnerable. And greed, that's a big one. Greedy people are people that are always trying to add and accumulate more material wealth, despite the fact that it can come to the expense of another's well-being. What these two vices have in common is that they both have no regard or any compassion for the poor. Anybody who possesses these vices would never even consider going out of their way to help another in need. Now, for a story related to POP, a local chocolatier named Mark Forat from London, Ontario, has launched an initiative called Forat Feeds Families. In this initiative, Forat makes chocolates, sells them, and uses the money to put food kits together for low-income families in London, Ontario. He recalled that after the COVID-19 pandemic started, he decided that he wanted to help and do something for those who were most affected by the virus. Well, that about wraps up this week's episode of Catholic Teen Teachings, and in conclusion, preferential option for the poor and vulnerable is a very important Catholic social teen teaching because it affects everybody all around the world. In Canada, in Russia, in Germany, and the Philippines, there will always be people who are not as fortunate as others, and it is our duty as followers of Christ, to always give out a helping hand. Now, with that being said, I hope you all drive home safely. Have a good night. Bye. Happy Halloween.